Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to the Checkin In podcast. My name is Biniam. I'm your host. Today is the 22nd of October. 22nd of October. We are hastening towards the end of the month, and it just happens to be the end of the week as well. So happy Friday to all of you. Glad to have you for a few moments this morning. Join me on the Checkin In podcast. Today's episode is a significant one. Number 80. We are at the 80th episode of the Checkin In podcast, and we continue to tick our way forward. So I am so thrilled to be able to be building something worthwhile building. With each coming episode, we continue to progress towards something as we participate together. Of course, we don't aimlessly just venture into this engagement. The Check-In podcast has three key pillars: awareness, kindness, and happiness. These are three things that I've come to resonate and celebrate in my personal life. And I invite you guys to join me on the same agenda as well. In these three pillars, we focus on our part in it, how we are progressing through it. For myself, I see myself intentionally progressing my way forward through these experiences. And first is awareness, like I said, awareness of who I am. Some might ask, haven't you already gotten to know yourself well enough? Well, I am in the midst of getting to know myself, but here's the thing. I also account for the fact that I keep changing as a human being. I keep changing over time. And so hence the importance of me to say, hey, how can I continue to keep an awareness of the changing Biniam? The way I'm changing my perspectives and ideas and commitments and obligations and all those sort of things that I'm reflecting on. And so it's an ongoing thing. I would suggest an ongoing thing where I am focusing on saying, how can I keep tabs on how I'm shifting over time, and in that process of change, how can I extend kindness to myself? That's the second piece: kindness to me and how I'm shifting over time. And of course, finally, happiness, processing my way through all of the other necessary emotions to get to happiness. That's another commitment. Welcome to the 80th episode of the Checkin In podcast. Thrilled to have you here joining me this morning. And this morning's question we're asking. So, if you don't know what else we do in addition to attending to awareness, kindness, and happiness in reference to ourselves, we also look at a reflecting question every morning, and we consider that question, and then we appropriate it to ourselves. We answer the question for ourselves, saying, where do I sit on this one here? How do I experience this? Where do I want to move in my exposure to this opportunity? And so those are some key elements that we spend time on. And for my part, sharing this experience with you is not to help you first and foremost, although I'm happy that it does help some of you. For me, this is more of a self care activity. And so this is my way of locking it in and making sure I've got some accountability to go through the questions in a systematic way. I'm getting to the end of the list of questions that I've been working my way through for the past few months. And it's been fantastic being able to apply those questions in my personal life to understand how is it that I am as a person continuing to grow and evolve. That's what I'm after, is how can I grow? When I think about the people that I spend time with, that's a question I'm asking, is in this in the company of these individuals, or of this individual, how am I personally growing through the experience? Is this a symbiotic relationship? Meaning, is this a contribution of two sides to something better? I'm very aware of the kind of influences that are coming into my life. And if you aren't, I would encourage you to consider, what does it look like for you to be intentional about who you spend time with? What is the expectation of that time spent together? Well, how is it rubbing off on you? And how are you growing through that experience? Worthwhile reflections. And so that's something that I'm ongoing committing myself to in this venture we call life together. So, welcome. Today's question we are answering is, what advice or encouragement would you give to your future self? What advice or encouragement would you give to your future self? This, of course, as I'm looking at it on its face value, is a question that is getting us to consider our future context. It's getting us to think into the future and say, how can I prepare well for it? By way of what I would actually say to myself if I were to give myself some tips along the way, if I were to give myself some encouragement based on how I know me well. I like this question because this is a question I think that only you can answer for yourself and only I can answer for myself. Consider I could be asked by others and saying, what would you tell me based on what you know about me, about my future? Like, what would you tell my future self based on how you know me? And that is one way to approach the question. But today's question is more in line with how would you answer this question for yourself? Because no one has walked through your shoes like you have. No one has seen the world from your vantage point like you have. And so, along those lines, how can you apply all of the wealth of knowledge and all the insights that you've learned through experience over time? How can you take all of that and appropriate it to yourself in a very specific way that speaks to you, in a way that only you be like, yep, I know exactly what that means? Because goodness, this is something that it's almost like a skilled surgeon who is very good at his craft with a scalpel. He just goes right to town and he knows exactly where that blade is going to go. He's going to apply the effects of that blade for something better, and he's able to use that very skillfully. Whereas if you were to give that to, I don't know, someone who's unskilled with that, it's very clumsy, right? So this question, I feel it puts us in the category of the surgeon because we're able to be aware of our experiences. We can reflect on our experiences and say, here is what I would tell my future self based on the experiences that I've come through so far and what I find meaningful for me in embracing for how to best serve that future version of yourself. So it's a future directing question, getting us to reflect into the future. But then notice what else is happening here, my dear friends. As we're reflecting into the future about what advice we give to ourselves in the future, do you know that the substance of whatever that is, whatever you're going to say to yourself in the future, you first of all have to look into your past. You have to reflect on your past and consider what are some of the things worth keeping that I want to reapply to myself in the future. So it's almost like a recycling of sorts here. You're saying, based on where I've already come through in the past, I'm going to take that information through the present and say, this is going to be what I find very important to pass on to my future self by way of counsel, encouragement, advice, etc. And I'm going to take that and put it into my future self and say, don't forget this, remember this, reflect on this, act on this, implement this. Like so many ways in which we can say the past continues to speak into our future. That's for me as a life recalibrator. One of my mottos in the context of that business is I want to help recalibrate my past so that I can rewrite my future. Do you see the important connection there, dear friends? The important connection meaning that as we plan for the future, we have to take into stock where we've come from in the past and what we're bringing to the table in the present that will help serve us in the future. Even now, like we're in the midst of making decisions about our future in such a way that says, hey, based on what I've experienced in the past year, how can I use that in a helpful way for the future? Does that make sense? There's a real connection there that I find is a strong point of bridging together the past and the future in the present as we are participating even in answering this question. Again, for those of you coming in, the question we're answering today is, what advice or encouragement would you give to your future self? And I was just saying that to speak into our future, we need to look into our past. And it brings this idea, this reflection for me that I've observed in many. And I was also there once upon a time where, for many of us, our past is not a place that we find a lot of encouragement in. Our past is not a place where we find happy memories. A past is it's generally a place where we avoid going to because it is quite painful. And now that we've survived it, we just don't want to go back to that and sort of bring down our morale because it's a difficult thing to look into and reflect on and say, here's what I would say going into the future. It's a very painful place for many. And I am sorry to hear that that is so for many of you. For many of you, I'm sorry to hear that that is so. Um, Question coming in here from the prince. He asked, "How do you deal with failure and comparing yourself with others and your peers?" That's a great question. Yes, I've I can relate. And I think so many, Prince, and I want to say thanks for that question. So many of our listeners can relate to that question. Again, the question is, hey, Kyle, how do you deal with failure and comparing yourself with others and your peers? That comparison piece. Can I suggest that that question, Prince, is one of those things that robs so many of joy in their life. And what do I mean by that? When we're comparing ourselves to others, we're saying, hey, me in this experience right now, comparing myself to someone else in a similar experience or not, there is something that you're correlating there and saying, how do I stack up with this individual in such a way that you're giving them more worth and you're diminishing your worth? Here's what's happening. Let's say it's at school or at work where you're looking at someone and saying, man, their life seems so successful. They seem to have things together. They seem to always be happy. They seem to, um, just have the experiences that I'd love to have, but I don't have access to. Maybe they go on vacations. Maybe they're able to buy a new car, eat out whenever they like. There's this comparison where you're like saying, here's me comparing myself, and I'm usually in the place of deficit. How is it that I seem to be so far behind? I appreciate the question on the business, Kyle. Let me answer that in just a few moments here, okay? So yes, there is that component there of comparison that brings down our worth when we're saying, hey, so and so seems to be doing a lot better than I am. And so as we compare ourselves that way, we're usually putting ourselves in that lacking category. My worth is diminished in reference to this person whose worth is up here. Here's how I've learned to deal with that, Prince, and that is as follows. I remind myself that this person is as equal to me in our worth as human beings. That means they may be observationally really successful. I don't know. Like maybe that's just a facade they're putting on. I have no idea. They may seem to have everything together. They may have some experiences that I'd love to have access to. I can be happy for them. And I actively try to be happy for them, saying, man, I'm glad that they're doing really well. However, I'm going to also figure out my own stuff. They got their own stuff. I got my own stuff. I know for 100% sure their life is not perfect. Why? Because they are just a human being like me, trying to figure things out going forward. And we're together fumbling in this thing we call life. Now, the reality I've observed is that most of us peacock and try to look really presentable. Here I am sitting before you looking really smart and so on. And I'm about to answer Kyle's question, which is going to be a very vulnerable share to show you how I, as a human being, I'm still trying to figure stuff out as well. Everyone has a unique story experience and we're on different paths. Absolutely. If you can remind yourself that everyone is trying to figure out their own stuff, and regardless of what they're presenting, that they're just like you trying to figure stuff out, that for me is a real encouragement to say, hey, I don't have to be catching up with their experience because I got my own to figure out. And I'm going to try the best I can with what insights and gifts and skill set that I have to make my way in life. And I can do that while also extending happiness, gratitude for them, saying, hey, I'm so genuinely happy that you seem to be doing really well, you know? But in reality, most of us who seem well put together, especially going down a busy street where there's lots of restaurants and people are having lots of fun and you see the sports car coming by. I like how one speaker said it. You don't know if that driver behind the Porsche wheel is just at the point, for example, of thinking about and wrestling with ongoing thoughts of wrapping his vehicle around the next tree, for example. There's so much that we hide inside here by way of pain and uncertainty and insecurity and so many like challenging things. So why not just live life in a real way and say, hey, be happy for them while you figure out your own stuff. And then when they open up and share stuff that they found challenging, be also human and saying, here's how I'm processing that. Let me give you a model. Kyle was asking, how's the business going? I don't need to answer if it's too personal. I don't mind answering because I like being upfront and how can I say transparent? Yes, because that's one of my commitments now. I've taken a significant risky decision to take time off driving for Uber and focus on the business. That means I've had no income coming in. It's been a very uncertain season for me as I've walked into it. So in short, Kyle, I've been working really hard. I've tried to like learn as much as I can in a sphere, in a world that it's not my forte. I know where my skill set lies, and so I've been learning and trying to implement the merits and the suggestions of people that I admire and value their input this way. Um, so yeah, I'm coming to the end of that period where my point of extension can't exceed anymore. And so in short, with all of my work in the business, I haven't really seen a lot of response back at all. And so it's been quite discouraging, extremely discouraging for me as I have invested heavily into it and I have some expectations of what I was hoping to see out of it. But it hasn't quite panned out as I was banking on it to. I thought I was making some informed, risky decisions, and they just don't seem to have panned out. In a certain way, it feels like I've been playing a game of Monopoly in real life, and I'm not doing very well in the game. And so I'm gonna keep on going through the weekend here. Still working hard at it, but I think I have to make some hard decisions into next week and maybe do some recalibrations of sorts, to use a word that I often use even in my business context. It just means maybe it's a slower pace for me. And so as I see that, and as I also feel the pressure of what that means, yeah, it's going to be a very difficult season that I'm walking into. I don't see myself as a failure. So I don't struggle that way. I definitely think I have something that is wonderful, worthwhile sharing, and I tried the best I could, but I think I'm just going to have to shift back into something a little bit different for the time being and going forward. So yeah, thank you for asking. Hope everything goes well, brother. Thank you. I appreciate that. Should we strive to be happy or find a purpose to make our life more meaningful? I think if you're trying to find happiness outside of finding your purpose, you are going to keep on searching for that phantom of happiness. I think, in some sense, happiness in a deep, resonating way, Prince, comes about when we are in our purpose in life. Does that make sense? You could be the most, you could be the most wealthy person, and if you don't have a purpose, you have resources, but you have no way to fuel those resources and make your life count. Does that make sense? And so I think, from at least in my reference, happiness is easier accessed when you are in your lane in life, when you are in your purpose, when you're doing what you're made to do. Does that make sense? So, yeah, I would be encouraging those who are striving to experience more happiness in life to find out what were you made to do? What is it that you feel you're really good at? And how can you apply yourself in getting better in that zone there? Because in the middle of your purpose, you find that sense of satisfaction, joy, happiness, in essence. We fall and have obstacles to overcome so that we can find answers and learn from them. You're totally right. Yes, absolutely, Prince. Yeah, it's just the place that I'm in. I hear that and it makes sense logically, and it's going to be hard work for me to remind myself that in the midst of experiences, hard decisions that I have to make, and awkward and challenging conversations I'm going to have to engage in going forward here. So yeah, I hear you. So thank you for the questions, and yeah, I don't mind being vulnerable again, just because this is the premise of why I share my experiences with you guys, so you can see that not even I, successful as I may seem, don't have everything together. I'm just trying to sort stuff out too. And yeah, it doesn't always work in a way that benefits you, even though you may have done everything right, even though you may have sort of gone down a pathway where it's like, like I did everything that I thought I was supposed to do, and still it didn't pan out. That's been my experience in life. So you look at these discouraging factors, and for me, I just remind myself, right? I am not worthless because I didn't fulfill here, but it just means I'm going to have to reappropriate those expectations that I had and say, okay, I'm going to take a step back and try again. Try again after I set things in order again, because I still have commitments I have to attend to, right? So thanks. Thanks for listening, guys. I appreciate that. Back to the question, what advice or encouragement would I give to myself in the future? I was just reflecting on the fact that this is the past being brought into the present for future application, right? And what would I say? Uh, you know, I was just thinking about how, in answering the question, we're usually going through various experiences right now that sort of inform our forward progression, right? And so here I am in the midst of, yeah, some significant discouragement and some consideration of hard things I'll have to address. And I'm wondering if that's going to play heavily, but I don't think it will. I think still for me, what I would say to my future self, what I would say to my future self, what advice I'd give to my future self, which is actually a really, oh, Kyle says, sorry, Benny, but I will need to go for now. No worries, my friend. Thank you for being here. So appreciate you. Um, yeah, I was just thinking about the other element, and that's advice that we would give to ourselves in the future. And here's something paradoxical for me. I would perceive that as I go forward in life, I am I'm growing smarter. I'm growing more intuitive, right? I'm applying things from the past. And so here's me talking to my future self who has more insight and more awareness and more experiences and saying, here's what I'd encourage you to consider by way of advice. So this is an interesting question that way. At the very heart of it, I think I would continue saying the thing that has resonated with me so strongly up to this point in life, and that is I'd want to remind myself, to encourage myself, to hold myself to the account of what does honesty look like as you're going forward in all your affairs? What does honesty look like because I have lived for so long lacking honesty or transparency? How can I bite the bullet by walking into those experiences into my future? Most of us are we we kind of go through life in a way where we want to shield ourselves from pain, and that's understandable. We go through life in a way whereby, are you Orthodox, by the way? I'm not Orthodox, friends. No, I was Baptist. We go through life in this context where we're aware of things that hurt us once upon a time, and we've learned really well how are we going to protect this. And one of the ways we do that is by speaking white lies sometimes, white lies that we are comfortable with, but that continue to give a presentation that we have everything to put together. For example, Prince asked me a question. He said, hey, how are things going business wise? And I gave a very raw and vulnerable and transparent answer. And that answer wasn't very flattering. It was one that was like, oh. And it's a season where it's it's going to be a challenge to work my way through. It's not going to be fun, but I'm going to have to do it. I'm going to have to do it. Now, for most people, they would look at that experience they're having, they would be like, no way anyone's ever going to find out about this, because if I were to give that response, I would feel like I'm less than. They would look at me as incompetent or unsuccessful, and that's a painful thing for many, right? And so they'll say, oh, everything's great, thank you for asking, and they'll just kind of pretend moving forward, right? But I don't want to do that. I've been there before. I know what that's been like for me to live a life like that and setting those kind of um, trajectories in play where my dishonesty has led to ends that I was not proud about. So, what does it look like now for me to speak truthfully and honestly and say, so here's my experience right now. It may not be great news. It may not be comfortable to hear, but thank you for expressing interest in hearing it. And here's me sharing myself in a real way, and you're going to get the real me. That's important for me. So, as I'm going forward in life, I still see at the very core of me one of those really important elements that I'm going to be in community. And how can I make this part of me being in community? Not this kind of experience where I am disconnected from the people around me, but where I'm learning how to be connected to them. Even as I shared with you how things are really going for me, don't you feel, listeners, that you in some sense felt closer to me because, okay, this is Biniam unveiled here. This is the Biniam that we wouldn't have guessed at the beginning of the podcast because he looks pretty well put together, right? This is the Biniam in essence that is true from what he's really going through. This is the side of intimacy that many people long to be in the midst of and experience, and yet find it inaccessible because it takes vulnerability or willingness to be vulnerable and share that vulnerability with others to be able to experience the response in a similar fashion, right? When I'm willing to be vulnerable with others around me, they're also willing to share life in the real lane for themselves. They feel safe enough to say, okay, I'm going to put down the defenses over here because I can see obviously that you're in a season or you're in a zone where you are going to be honest about this, right? So that's an important consideration I feel there. Does this answer your question, friends? The question again was, what advice or encouragement would I give to myself in the future? My future self, I would continue giving myself the same advice I'm giving to myself now. Why? Because that for me is super important. That for me is really informative. I don't see this changing for me. And if anything, I want to keep on hammering on that same note because I don't ever want to make it possible for me to go back to where I once was. I don't want to go back to where I once was because that was a really unhelpful, painful place to be. And so I would say to my future self, future Vinium, keep on this pathway of building your legacy on transparency and honesty in the way you're connecting and engaging with people around you. Keep on that pathway because once upon a time, you weren't on that pathway. You saw the devastation that brought about in your life and in theirs because they thought they knew you and they didn't really know the real Biniam. So, what does it look like for me to continue in this new opportunity in life to give the real me, regardless of the painful outcomes that are entailed? And another way of saying it, and I remember this from my childhood: honesty is the best policy. Yeah. So that's what I would be saying to my future self. And yes, perhaps that answer has in some way elements of my present experience wrapped up in that response. Um, yeah. Um, Life is tough. Welcome to it. I keep telling my baby sister, who I encouraged to move out here, I was very upfront with her before she moved out here, saying, and what I was telling her was, when you move out here, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy because there's going to be discouragements along the way. There's going to be things that aren't going the way you hoped they would go. There are some experiences that will make you really second guess and say, was this the right decision? You know? Yet in the midst of it, we're going to make it through it. And she's definitely had some challenges while she's out here. My friends, to me, in my experience, life is struggle. Life is already a struggle. We're trying to sort things out. I think it's a waste of time to pretend, to try and put on airs, to try and seem like you have everything put together in a way that um, isn't reflecting real life, real values, and so on. So I just say, let's live life on purpose. Let's live life on purpose. My business is as a life recalibrator is helping others recalibrate their past to be able to rewrite future, their future context. I always have an optimistic forecast in my future as a result because I'm striving for something better. That's why I apply myself to this process of how can I be a better me? How can I encourage others to be a better them? And collectively, how can we build something in community that is worthwhile remembering in a really happy way, saying, that was tough, but I'm glad we did what we did, or said what we said, or engaged in the way we engaged, because here's the outcome. Here's what we're experiencing in the aftermath of it. That is really important. So, what advice would you give yourself in the future? What encouragement would you give your future self? I would love to hear some of your insights because I don't have access to them. Hence why I ask. I share mine because I'd rather you not have to guess, but say, okay, I know how many things. And I'd love to hear from you as well. Send me a note along the way. Send me a message, comment on the video. I would love to see that engagement and hear what that looks like for you. Today is Friday. It's the weekend. I won't be back till Monday for another episode of the Binge Checking Podcast, episode 81. But until then, as you're going through the weekend, as you're applying yourself to whatever plans you have, whatever's on the radar schedule-wise, don't forget, my dear friends, live life on purpose. You are worthwhile enjoying and savoring this life that is very short. Have a great weekend. Bye for now.